Dr. Kjelvan considered himself unusually tolerant for a Verloxian. He'd treated beings who inhaled gaseous mercury to regulate mood, and one particularly rowdy Frulk who snorted powdered obsidian for spiritual alignment. But even by galactic standards, the human had stumped him. "Could you sit still, please?" Kjelvan adjusted the neuroprobe's position as the biped fidgeted again, scuffing his boots against the sterile alloy floor. "You are making the metabolic imaging quite difficult." "Sorry, Doc," said the man, lifting his hands in mock surrender. "Just a little wired. Had my usual morning shot." Kjelvan glanced at the screen. Caffeine levels within acceptable range, though elevated. No, not coffee. I meant my vinegar." The probe emitted a low whine and blinked amber. Kjelvan frowned, tapping the screen. "Vinegar?" "Yeah, raw apple cider vinegar. Unfiltered with the mother." Kjelvan didn't know what that last part meant, but the scan lit up with a warning. A flagged compound, acetic acid in significant concentration, was circulating through the man's blood. Trace erosion detected along his esophageal lining, minor epithelial inflammation in the stomach. To any trained xenophysician, this was mild corrosive exposure. "Why," Kjelvan said slowly, "have you ingested a substance marked as corrosive and mildly toxic to most sentient species?" The human leaned back on the medical bench and scratched his beard. His tag read James Weller, civilian contractor, terraforming logistics. "It burns the weak parts out," James said. He smiled, not with bravado but like a man reciting an old family saying. "Keeps me sharp, cuts down bloating. Some folks swear it cures headaches too." Kjelvan froze. Across 6 star cycles, he had studied over 400 species, cataloged 1,000 pathologies, and assisted in reconstructing organs from nanosludge. And yet here sat a being who deliberately consumed acid because it made him feel better? "This is not medical," Kjelvan said, stunned. "This is self-injury disguised as maintenance." "Nope," James said. "It's a cleanse." A silence settled between them. Kjelvan watched the man's vitals flutter. Heart steady, if slightly elevated, no signs of acute distress. Still, the biochemical data didn't lie. "Your gastrointestinal lining shows consistent low-level irritation. That suggests chronic exposure. Daily since 2018, James confirmed proudly. You have been voluntarily ingesting poison for 7 Earth years. Technically, it's not poison. It's health food. You can buy it by the gallon." Kjelvan didn't blink. He didn't have eyelids, but if he did, they would have narrowed in disbelief. Before he could process further, the intercom crackled overhead. "Intake complete," chirped the medbay assistant. "Dr. Kjelvan, please proceed with onboarding prep for Sector 12 team." Kjelvan exhaled, a slight flare of his facial bends. "You are cleared for duty, Mr. Weller, but I will need to file a note in your health profile regarding your—" He struggled for a word that wouldn't sound accusatory. "Ritual." James hopped off the bench and cracked his back like someone shaking off a nap, not a scan that had just identified internal inflammation. "Sure thing, Doc. I'll even bring you a bottle if you're curious." Kjelvan almost recoiled. "That will not be necessary." As James left, Kjelvan remained at the terminal, rewriting his initial diagnosis. Not poisoning, not an error, a voluntary act, a self-initiated trial. Humans, it seemed, didn't avoid pain. They swallowed it. And this wasn't an isolated case. Not entirely. Across the last 3 Earth cycles, he'd treated humans who ran until their legs bled, fasted until they hallucinated, submerged themselves in freezing water for mental clarity, and one disturbing report of a crew member intentionally breaking down their muscle tissue through repetitive motion, only to rebuild it stronger. Now this. Kjelvan tapped the console and began compiling a case study. 2 days later, James returned to the med bay not for treatment, but to check in before a mission deployment. This time, his blood pressure was slightly elevated, and his throat tissue showed increased sensitivity. "I've been coughing a little," he admitted, voice rough. "Just in the mornings." Kjelvan pulled up the scan. Likely a result of repeated exposure to acidic compounds. Your laryngeal tissues are not designed for long-term contact with acetic acid vapor. I must urge you to discontinue use. James scratched his head. Yeah, but it's part of the regimen. Push through the discomfort, come out cleaner. That's how we were taught. Keelvan studied him. Taught by whom? Honestly, James chuckled. Some guy on the internet? Keelvan shut off the scan. He needed more time. And perhaps a translator. Not for language, but for philosophy. James didn't come back for another 12 days. Not until his squad was dragged in for routine post-deployment checks, still in partial exosuits, crusted with red Martian dust and smelling of overclocked synthetics and sweat. His voice was hoarse. This time, it wasn't just a little cough. Kelvan had heard it from the corridor, a dry, rattling hack that strained the vocal cords. When the human finally stepped into the med bay, his skin was flushed around the cheeks and his eyes slightly glassy. James, Keelvan said, gesturing toward the diagnostic platform, sit down. I'm fine, James rasped. That declaration is unsupported by observable data. Your respiratory patterns are irregular, your oxygen uptake is below baseline, and you are favoring your left side. James winced as he lowered himself onto the bench. Took a bit of a tumble on a slope. Landed weird. Probably just bruised a rib. Kelvan scanned him silently. Subdermal bruising confirmed. Intercostal strain. Mild effusion. Nothing displaced, but pain would spike with any torso movement. The vocal irregularities were more concerning. You've developed moderate inflammation in the trachea and upper bronchial passages, Kelvan said. No bacterial or viral signatures present. I believe this is chemical irritation. James rubbed the back of his neck. Could be dust. The winds on site kicked up bad this week. Kelvan tilted the scanner forward. And did you maintain your ingestion regimen during this deployment? Yeah. James looked away. Every morning. How much? 2 tablespoons on an empty stomach? Water? James hesitated. You did not dilute it. I ran out of packets. Figured I'd tough it. Keelvan suppressed a hiss of dismay. You were on dehydrated rations and low humidity oxygen, operating under physical stress, and you drank raw acetic acid, undiluted? James offered a sheepish grin. Figured it'd help with digestion. Kelvan turned away for a moment, accessing the medbay terminal. His secondary mind was already preparing a formal alert to the Terran health officer assigned to interspecies cooperation. But first, he needed data. Not just scans. Behavior, motive. Why do you persist, he asked. Ingesting a substance that clearly harms you? Do you believe the short-term discomfort is worth it? James shrugged. It's not just about the vinegar. It's the idea behind it. Doing hard things, small things that hurt, to stay resilient. Kelvan looked at him. Resilience does not require injury. You ever train your body? James asked, stretching his sore arm. I was bred for medical service. My body was calibrated at maturity. Right. Humans don't get that. We break ourselves a little so we get stronger later. Athletes stress their joints, soldiers carry weight until their knees give out, some folks dunk themselves in ice water to build tolerance. This, he tapped his chest, is maintenance through stress. That is not stress, that is assault. You say tomato, I say metabolic preconditioning. Kelvan paused and then looked back at the scans. You require 2 full days of rest. No acidic intake. Only hydrating fluids and mild anti-inflammatories. If the tracheal tissues scar, your voice could permanently degrade. James didn't argue. He nodded, slower this time. The pain must have started reaching thresholds even he couldn't mask. By the next morning, his cough had worsened. Labored breathing, especially after rising from sleep. No fever, no infection, purely chemical inflammation. He would sleep through every exit from space, directly. Kelvan administered an inhaled buffer compound to reduce surface irritation and placed James under medical observation. There were protests, of course, but The man had enough sense not to leave. In the quiet of the isolation pod, James finally asked, "Do other species just avoid pain all the time?" Keel Van folded his limbs and settled into the adjacent chair. "Most species equate pain with failure. A body that suffers is one that has erred. We correct the conditions that cause it." James nodded. "Makes sense. But you don't get stronger from avoiding it." Keel Van hesitated. "You get functional, efficient. Evolution seeks survival, not valor." James stared at the wall. "My grandfather used to say, if it doesn't sting, it's not working. Grew up during hard times, taught us to lean into it." "I have encountered similar proverbs in human literature. The logic is paradoxical." James chuckled, then grimaced. "We're full of those. I mean, we freeze our bodies to lower inflammation, then go sit in saunas to sweat the toxins out. Half the time, we don't know if we're fixing something or challenging ourselves to survive the fix." Kelvan looked at the oxygen feed regulator, steady and quiet. James had fallen asleep mid-conversation. He made a note. Subject uses pain as verification of health, sees adversity as purification, treats discomfort not as a warning but as a test. 3 days later, with his breathing restored and throat tissues beginning to regenerate, a process Kulvan warned could take several weeks to fully stabilize, James was cleared to return to light duties. The Vinegar was locked in medbay quarantine, but Kilvan knew this wasn't over. Because the human wasn't cured. He was just resting before the next burn. Kelvan had reviewed the footage 3 times before he believed it. The incident had occurred during a routine inspection of the colony's biosphere domes, and the footage came from a shoulder cam worn by one of the field medics. James was kneeling next to a ventilation hatch, attempting to reroute a blocked airflow intake. He stood up, swayed, then suddenly dropped to his hands and knees, retching violently. By the time the med team reached him, he was gasping, throat raw again, eyes watering. His abdominal muscles were clenched so tight that later he'd complain of soreness like he'd done 100 sit-ups. Gilvan found him in the medbay again, sitting upright but visibly winded, sipping from a rehydration pack. "Something disagree with you?" Kelvan asked without greeting. James looked up with bleary eyes. "Tried a new batch from Earth, unpasteurized, extra strong. You smuggled corrosive fluid into a regulated zone." "I didn't smuggle it. I requested it through civilian supply. Fully declared." Kielvan pressed a hand to his cranium. "And you consumed this batch without testing compatibility under local atmospheric variants." James tilted his head. "Didn't think I had to. It's just vinegar." "No, James, it is not just vinegar. It is an unstable organic acid that, in concentration, can act as a mucosal irritant, gastrointestinal trigger, and, as we are witnessing, a respiratory catalyst for vomiting and epiglottic strain." James shifted, wincing. "So, not great for field work. You have partially abraded the base of your esophagus. There is micro-tearing. If you continue on this path, you will cause long-term damage. I am placing a formal restriction on your clearance for all unsupervised health rituals involving unregulated compounds." The human rolled his head back. "Come on, Doc. You act like I'm injecting myself with sulfur." "You're ingesting a liquid that registers at pH 2.4, Kuvan snapped. "Do you understand what that number means to your tissues?" James sighed. "Faresby means it stings, but that's the point." Cale Van paced away. It was the same pattern. Discomfort as validation, stress as purification. He wasn't just resisting medical advice. He was ritualizing harm. Later that evening, Kelvan met with Dr. Lara Halston, the colony's human general practitioner. They convened in the small medical conference hub between their offices. "You're treating James Weller, right?" Halston asked after Kelvan explained the latest incident. "Yes. He insists on continuing ingestion of raw, acetic compounds, despite clear pathology." Halston leaned back, arms crossed. "He's one of those grit types. Grew up rural, probably. I've seen it before. That mindset doesn't leave easily. They're convinced discomfort is growth, even if it impairs organ function. Especially then, she said grimly. Pain means it's doing something. Gilvan ran a hand down his interface panel. I need to understand. Do humans derive emotional reinforcement from this behavior? Yes, often. There's something about surviving pain that gives people like him a sense of identity. Control, even. He's not just drinking it to be healthy, he's drinking it to feel like he's in charge of his own biology. Gilvan nodded slowly. That aligned with his field notes. The following morning, James was back, this time with a swelling just under his sternum. I've got this weird tightness, he said, pointing to his upper abdomen. Feels like pressure, not pain. Kelvan ran a localized scan. It is esophageal edema, likely a reaction to repeated chemical exposure. James blinked. So, swelling? Yes. And if you keep stretching it like this, it could ulcerate. You'll bleed internally. For once, James didn't immediately respond with a joke. He looked genuinely uncomfortable. Not just physically, emotionally. I didn't think it was that bad, he muttered. It is that bad, Kelvan said. And the worst part? It didn't need to happen. James nodded. Guess I took it too far. You did not take it anywhere, Kelvan said softly. You followed a path built for suffering and called it discipline. That landed hard. Kelvan saw the tension in James's shoulders. He wasn't angry. He was tired. The kind of tired that didn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying invisible weights too long. Gilvan offered him a nutrient pack and sat with him as the human sipped, swallowing slowly, as if embarrassed that it went down without pain. They sat in silence for several minutes before James spoke again. You ever seen someone keep doing something that hurts just because stopping felt like losing? Kelvan glanced at the monitors, the swelling shrinking slightly with each regulated breath. Yes, but healing only feels like losing to those who confuse injury with strength. James looked down at his hands. For the first time, he didn't argue. James didn't speak much during his mandatory 10-day observation. He reported his symptoms when asked, swallowed the bland, pH numeral meals without complaint, and took the mucosal repair supplements as prescribed. The swelling gradually receded. The tissue damage, while moderate, would take weeks to fully heal, and even then, Kelvan warned him, any return to acidic self-treatment could leave permanent scarring. You may not notice the degradation, Kelvan told him during one of their morning assessments. Not at first, but your digestive rhythm will change. Reflux, cramping, unpredictable absorption, and eventually chronic inflammation could cascade into other systems. James listened, nodding, but he hadn't looked Kelvan in the eye since the day of the esophageal scan. Not until the 8th day. I didn't think it was ritual, James said quietly, as they reviewed a final blood panel. Wasn't trying to be some martyr. Kelvan didn't look up from the scanner, but I liked that it hurt. It made me feel like I was doing something hard that others wouldn't, like I was earning my stability. Kelvan gently closed the file. Endurance has value, but not when it requires your organs to fail. James chuckled dryly. Sounds dumb when you say it like that. It sounds human, Kelvan replied. Your species does not shy from pain. You ingest it, train in it. Sometimes you even pass it down as culture. James looked up. You think it's wrong? No, Kelvan said after a pause. I think it is dangerous, and beautiful, and deeply alien. They were quiet for a moment. Later that day, James was cleared for light physical activity. The colony's gymnasium, though sparsely used, was equipped with human-grade resistance equipment. Kelvan stopped by once during a shift break and found James alone, lifting light weights with deliberate slowness, nothing excessive. He wasn't pushing himself to collapse, just moving, breathing. That evening, Kelvan entered a note into James's medical profile. Subject shows signs of behavioral shift. Compliance with dietary protocol is improving. No new lesions observed. Risk of re-injury present but reduced. Recommend continued counseling. 3 weeks passed. When James returned for his final clearance scan, Van was ready for another battle, some new angle of justification, some new ancient proverb dressed up as therapy. Instead, James pulled out a water bottle and held it up. "It's just water," he said. "I see," Van replied. James smiled. "Tastes like nothing, which is starting to feel better than burning." Van nodded, slowly. "Your tissue regeneration is nearly complete. Residual inflammation is resolving. You've likely reversed most of the damage. And if I screw up again? Then we treat it again," Van said. "But ideally, you don't wait until it breaks." James leaned against the exam table. "You know, there's still folks back home who'd call this giving up, softening, losing the edge." "Then I suppose," Van said, "you will have to find a new edge." James was quiet for a moment. "I think I will." 2 days later, Van received a package. No note, just a plain unmarked bottle with a golden liquid inside, sealed but clearly vinegar. A sample. An old version of an old belief. He didn't open it. He stored it in his cultural archive locker with a label: Human Tonic, Ritual Class. Self-directed stress ingestion, voluntary, symbolic. A week after that, Van ran into James again, this time by the colony's communal gardens. James was crouched down next to a soil bed, gently transplanting a sprout. "I thought you were assigned to logistics," Van said. "Still am," James replied. "This is just therapy. You are not ingesting the plants, I hope?" "Nope, just watching them grow. They take their time. No shortcuts." Van watched him for a moment, then said, "You're different." "Less vinegar," James said, brushing his palms together. "More water." That evening, Van updated the final entry in his case report. He paused before writing the conclusion. Subject has not abandoned ritual. He has changed it. Pain was never the addiction. It was proof. Now, healing is the proof. Van closed the file. And for the first time since meeting James Weller, he felt something he rarely allowed himself as a physician: hope.